games in the database, I actually see a game between Le Quang Lim and Leko. Hang on a second, Tanya. That game continued in a very logical vein. D6 was played. Now, knight e2 can be considered here, but I'm just not sure white has enough time to play this move and get the king side out. So main line here is e3. Now, black typically brings the knight out to d7 in order to connect the knights and be able to bring the queen out to a5. Now, the logical continuation here is bishop to d3. Black often throws in the move h6, just kind of flicking this move in, forcing the bishop to commit. And now this move queen a5, which is incredibly nasty because black sets up two threats. There's the immediate knight takes d5, and there's bishop takes e3. And white is forced to sacrifice a pawn. You have nothing better to do than to castle. And in most games, black gobbled up the pawn. Bishop takes e3, b takes e3. Now, important thing, Robert, is if you take the c pawn, which may seem more tempting to some people watching, I think you allow white to bring the pawn up to e4 and create this pawn wedge. So most people actually take on d5 here, and you get a very interesting position. We're following Dubab Nakamura as well as Le Quang Lim versus Leko. It's probably a situation of dynamic equality. White has sufficient compensation for the pawn, and maybe this is the kind of thing that Gukesh is going for. Maybe he studied this position very carefully, and if that's the case, after something like bishop c2 or c4, I would be kind of scared of the black if I wasn't really well prepared here, because I can envision a reality where black has a hard time kind of getting the queen side out.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Just optically, this position looks very, not just playable, but almost favorable for white, because black is up that central pawn, but you haven't developed your pieces at all. And so with the bishop pair, especially that light square bishop for white staring towards the black king side, you can envision a battery in the near future, dropping the bishop back to b1, lining it up with the queen, and some checkmating threats. This doesn't appear to be like that obvious for how black should continue in this type of dynamic. So I'm looking at this position. I think this is exactly what Gukesh is going for. In fact, he's already responded in the live board. D6, quickly e3, and almost certainly he'll place his bishop on d3 and continue from there.
Yeah, we might see an early h6 by Prague. What we will not see is the immediate queen a5, because that runs into the incredibly nasty bishop takes f6. You do not want your kingside pawn structures to be crippled here. That is why we see this early knight b8 to d7 preferred by a lot of top players in this position. But there are alternatives. Maybe you could consider bringing your light squared bishop out. I feel like Prague is already on his own. So I think whatever decisions he makes will be his independent decisions now.
And that appears to be the case, which means that fantastic opening choice from Gukesh. Whether Prague can solve all his problems, that remains to be seen. But I think that's a clear indication that Gukesh picked a very smart opening, one that Prague could not have expected, and now he's on his own. And if Gukesh can win this game and Nodirbek doesn't win his, Gukesh will be at minimum in a tie for first or in clear first if Vidic can get the job done. So I think this is a fantastic opening choice, putting a lot of pressure from the opening stage against a player who doesn't have the Benoni pawn structure very often. This is a clever decision from, well, I was going to say the youngster, but they're both very young. They're both very strong. But from the winner of the Chennai Grandmasters tournament, that is Gukesh. I think this was a lovely call by him.
It was indeed. Already kind of reaping the fruits as we see Nodirbek there, trying to get a sense of this position. Pretty encouraging sign early on from Gukesh. He's got to be relieved that Prague is taking his time. Well begun is half done, but he's certainly not halfway toward winning this game. Prague, he's going to take his time, try to make sure that he emerges from the opening with an acceptable position. And perhaps this is a good time, Robert, to keep going around the horn, because we have some incredibly exciting openings yet again on some of the other boards. We go to our bird's eye view in the top right between Firouzja and Nepo. This is music to my ears. If I'm understanding the position correctly, it is a Jabava London that was trotted out by Alireza Firouzja. And I'm also looking at the bottom right, Warmberdam versus Dingley Ren. There's a pawn on g4, and to the left of that, a ridiculous position in Ju Wenjun versus Wei Yi. My eyes are like darting, Robert, from board to board. I don't know where we go next.
I think I'd like to start with the game between Max Vormedam and Ding Liren, just because I'm curious with the last move that was played,
Yeah.
which was G4 when you've already castled. That's the game on the bottom right-hand side of our screen. And Danya, what a surprising move that is to face as we pull up the live board between Max Vormedam and Ding Liren. Hoodie Ding better be feeling comfortable because that G4 move, why can't you take that pawn? Let's show our viewers why sometimes greed is not so good.
Well, I was hoping you wouldn't ask that because I haven't yet determined an answer to that question. It reminds me of the time that in sixth grade, when my teacher was like, "Okay, everybody pull out your homework sheets." And that is, of course, when I remembered that the day previously she had assigned a worksheet to do. And so she starts collecting the homework student by student. And I think I managed to convince her to start collecting it from the left side, so that by the time she came all around the way to my side of the classroom, I had like hastily scribbled down the answers. So I'm just stalling. Please don't ask me what white wants to do after knight takes g4. And I think maybe Ding is wondering the same thing. What are some options here for white? Well, maybe knight b5, maybe even a move like queen to b5. I've actually seen this idea before, trying to deflect black's queen and remove a defender of the d6 pawn. Is there something tactical here?
That's what I'm wondering, the same exact thing, Danya. If there are some tactics, but I'm not quite seeing them because the bishop on b7 is loose in some positions. So that's important to note that oftentimes when there's a bishop stare down on the light square diagonal, when the knight on f3 moves out the way, if you can successfully do that with some kind of tempo, then some pieces can fall. But I don't see a way to make that happen. It feels far-fetched.
Yes, and queen b5, I'm kind of partial to this idea in general. Let's give it a shot. Queen b5. Now, there's one very important detail. If black refrains from the trade after queen c7, there is this potential tactic, bishop takes d6. I'm not sure that it works here. Maybe you flick in h3 and send the knight back to f6, but let me just illustrate the general concept here. Bishop takes d6. Okay, let's say bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, rook takes d6, rook takes d6. And of course, it becomes very clear that after queen takes d6, black loses the game. Queen takes b7. Still not the end of the story, queen c6. And Robert, I think white is spoiled for choice here. Nice little retreating knight move. Boom. And the rook in the corner is going to be trapped.
It's so nasty to end games like that. It looks like, I'm winning the rook in the corner. No, you're not. My queen protects it. Oh, yes, I am. A simple retreating knight move to open up the bishop. The rook cannot leave. It's a8 square, and thus it's won. That's a really classy line. And I think from the top down, this queen b5 idea is trying to loosen the defense of this d6 pawn. And it's not just the pawn on d6. The queen on b6, if we go back to the live board and then adding queen b5, that the queen on b6 defends the rook on d8. So let's say you trade queens on b5, the knight takes back, and then you think about blocking the diagonal and playing a move like e5, challenging that bishop. The rook on d8 lost its defender. So white can even take this pawn on e5. That black queen was doing such an important task of defending both d6 and the rook on d8, because if we see more trades, first of all, your bishop on b7 is hanging, so you probably have to include bishop takes g2. And now knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. The issue becomes apparent that if you do take this bishop on e5, I take your rook on d8 with check. I win my piece back, and then also win your trapped rook in the corner.
The issue becomes apparent. Why wasn't I invited to the baby shower? To the issue's baby shower? Was it a son or a daughter? Okay, sorry. Let's address the main question, though. What was the point of G4? The point of G4, I think, is precisely revealed. I didn't say. Did I make a pun? I didn't hear any puns. I don't know why you're laughing. The point is revealed precisely in this line. If the black knight were still on f6, after takes black, I think would have this knight jump to e4. And this knight jump to e4 adds another defender to the d6 pawn. And black could even follow up either with e5 or by developing the knight. Now the d6 pawn falls. And black's position collapses. So, wow, what an opening innovation by Max Warmerdam, and Ding Liren can't seem to catch a break. But just to shout out, Max Warmerdam, accompanied by his second, Luc Van Wely. a Dutch legend. He has played in the Tata Steel tournament countless times himself against the likes of Garry Kasparov, and he is not someone to be trifled with in the realm of opening preparation.
And look at Dingley Ren.
Yeah, here we go again.
You caught him in a moment where he is expressing his frustrations. And G4. So let's say White had a free turn, Danya. Is part of the point that the bishop on F4 now has a retreating square? It can safely drop back to G3 in case it's attacked. Is that part of the idea? Or is really White going for G4 to G5? Why G4? And what does it actually threaten if Black does not take it?
That's a great question, and it is hard to say because this is a committal move, but it's not like you're, throwing all of your pawns up the board. You absolutely can play the move H3, and your king is still fundamentally safe. My vote, of course, you're asking the wrong guy. I like seeing moves like G5. The H6 pawn is a hook, so I think it'll depend on how Black declines the sacrifice. If Black plays a neutral move like A6, which, by the way, is not totally unlikely. I think A6 makes some sense. My vote would probably still be H3. I think just keeping the virtues of the position, sitting on the position, is very effective because one of the things that makes this so annoying for Black, Robert, is the fact that it's very hard to find a home for this B8 knight. Knight C6, knight BD7, they both blunder this D6 pawn. So I'm not really seeing a good way for Black to untangle. And if you have to play moves like knight to E8 just so that you can complete the development, then I think we can safely say the opening has been a success for Max.
I'm with you there. The knight on B8 cannot easily develop, but now that we're mentioning it, if the knight does step forward to C6 right now, the D6 pawn will drop, but the rook on D2 will have to capture along the way, which means the B2 pawn will also fall. So I haven't calculated. I'm just trying to point out that the rook on D2, it's an aggressive piece doubled on a semi-open line, but it's also a defensive piece covering that B2 pawn, and that's a pretty important pawn in White's position, protecting the knight, and you can get dislodged if that queen can take on B2. So I'm not saying I know with any degree of certainty that knight C6 will be a good or even an acceptable try, but knight C6 is the type of move that you can play with a B2 pawn hanging at the end of the file.
Great observation. This has to be calculated, so presumably we're going to get a long thing here from Ding. We're already getting a long thing from Ding. He's spent 14 minutes and counting now, and it's one of those situations where he might have only scratched the tip of the iceberg, because the task that awaits him here is titanic indeed. Lots of candidate moves and a lot of calculation to do, really within every move. You have to look at knight G4, you have to look at knight C6, you have to consider a neutral move like A6. This is going to be a tough call for Ding, and one to watch. Another case of great opening preparation by Mr. Warmerdam.
Can I just make one line of analysis? I think that it's instructive to show what Ding might be considering, because I just mentioned a knight C6, I believe, is an okay option according to my eyes and hopefully the engine. But if we bring up the analysis board, that knight C6, you give up D6 to win B2. Let's go down the line. Bishop takes D6, bishop takes, rook takes, and then queen takes B2 because the knight on C6 does defend this rook on D8. I'm not sure if I should throw in rook takes D6 or not, but I was thinking, can White play queen B5 here? Similar to some of your ideas, the knight on C3 can be captured, but then you lose this bishop on B7, and we will see tactics on full display in this position. Let's keep going. Queen takes knight, because if you take the queen on B5, I think then you get into a worse endgame, just to maybe show that pawn takes B5, or even knight takes B5, but you fix the structure for White, and now you have an outside pass pawn.
Oh, yeah.
You see actually the engine suggesting that White is now heavily favored in this position thanks to these outside pass pawns and control of this open file, the D file. So let's not trade queens. That was your first instinct. Queen takes C3, queen takes B7. You can't even play rook takes D6 here. And maybe that's why from the start you couldn't play rook takes D6, because the A8 rook is hanging with check first, and only then will I take your rook on D6, which is loose. So what move do you play in this type of position, Danya? Because I'm looking at that rook on A8. I'm looking at the stare down of rooks in the D file, your loose knight on C6. It feels like Black may be hanging on by a thread, and it may be some kind of forcing continuation that is not easy to spot.
Such as knight D4, but I agree completely. No, this is not something that Ding will trust himself to go for. And remember, this position, he doesn't have the luxury of moving the pieces. We do. He would have to visualize this in his head, which is precisely what he's doing right now. You can kind of sense the wheels turning. I think this is great insight into the kind of stuff that he has to process and decide. Because whichever decision he makes here, the type of position he gets is completely different, right? Knight c6 is a very forcing move. It's a concrete way to try to solve your problems. Whereas a move like a6, it keeps the status quo, and it's maybe a little bit safer, but then you run the risk of just like being positionally worse. So I think great insight by you, Robert. Really, really interesting middle game. And we will update you on Ding's decision when he makes it. But maybe a good time for us to keep traveling around the horn because the other games are unfolding at a breakneck pace.
Let's do just that. I see some entertaining looking positions on the right-hand side. We just looked at the bottom right with Max Vernon playing g4. Alireza Firouzja also has a pawn on g4 stemming from a Jabal London. And then I'm still looking at the game second from the right on the bottom row. Wei Yi played some kind of Dutch. He is in the Netherlands after all, and it has become a combative clash with tension in the center. So, Danya, I'm guessing you want to go to the game between Firouzja and Nepo. It is, after all, one of your favorite openings.
Sure. Let's go to Firouzja land. I promise we won't spend too long on this game. It's a position that I'm kind of broadly familiar with. So perhaps we could just take a quick look at this game. It's one of the sharpest lines of the Jababa London, which is a great surprise weapon, as we can see, even at the very highest level. So let's rewind all the way back to the start. Okay, this was actually one knight c3, the Van Geet. The Van Geet by Alireza Firouzja, which I would add, Robert, is a move. I think the proper way to put it is with very little independent value. What that means is, in most cases, this move just essentially transposes to one of several openings. If black plays e5, you often transpose into the Vienna. If black plays d5, as Jan, or knight f6, as Jan did, you transpose, in this case, into a Jababa London, d5, d4, bishop f4, c5. Okay, now e2, e4 is very fashionable, but Firouzja plays kind of the old school move e3. And after the trade on d4, Robert, in my view, having analyzed this position very extensively, I think black's best move, life pro tip, is bishop c8 to g4. I think this just solves all of black's problems. But once again, Nepo, he goes for the old school line, a6, knight f3, and here once again, I think knight c6 is objectively slightly preferable to his move, bishop g4, but Nepo going for the most tactical variation, trading on f3, bringing out the knight, a long castle. This is all very well known. e6 and g2, g4. I have had this position many times in many different time controls with the white pieces. Now, bishop to d6, offering a bishop trade. Firouzja says, nope, I am keeping the bishop pair. Nepo brings out his queen to a5. And this is the live position, Robert, where generally I think you see white tucking away the king on b1 because already black has a host of kind of nasty threats. There is this nasty prospect of bishop to b4, so it might be worth throwing in the move king b1. Alireza might also be considering whether or not to flick in the pawn push g5, and there you have to calculate the ultra-concrete line knight to e4.
This gets sharp in a hurry, and for Alireza Firouzja, he is well ahead on the clock. So Jan Nepomniachtchi, I don't think, truly expected his opponent to play knight c3 on the very first move of the game, and he did take some time to respond on the first turn with knight f6. But now that we're here, this does look like a Alireza Firouzja position, but also a Jan Nepomniachtchi position. And I'm not saying that literally, because of course these are the two players who are sitting at the board and playing. But you know what I mean, Danya? This is this kind of combative style that is the trademark of both of them. I do feel that Alireza carries a little bit more risk here. And I know you're a fan of this opening from the white side, so it's not a question about the opening. But I think strategically speaking, black has done nothing wrong. You have a solid pawn chain from f7 to d5. Your center is defended. You have developed all your pieces of natural squares. White has extended pawns. The king is already committed to the queen side, so you could fall victim to an attack. So white does need to be more concrete than black does, I feel like. Otherwise, you could see this idea, like you said, knight coming to e4 for black, trying to pick up the a2 pawn. But if you calculate well, as Alireza Firouzja has been known to do, then you should have everything under control.
You're absolutely right. And this position has occurred twice. Once in the career of one of the earliest practitioners of this opening, Richard Rapport, who had this in 2014 against Predrag Nikolic, very strong grandmaster. In that game, white played king b1. Black brought the rook over to c8, another kind of stock attacking move. White initiated the kingside attack with g5, and kind of off they went. Black dropped the knight back to d7, and the way to play this position for white is to combine attacking moves on the king side with defensive moves on the queen side. And if we pull up an analysis board as just a quick context, what happens if white gets overexcited, falls too in love with his play on the king side? Well, white could get checkmated very, very quickly, a lot faster than black could get mated if black is not careful. So for instance, let's say that we see king b1. Let's say that black responds with rook c8, white pushes g5, black drops the knight back, and here Rapport played the move bishop e3 to c1, a prophylactic measure. Why is this necessary? Because if white pushes h4, then already I think knight to b4 might be a very, very nasty move. And if you push a3 thinking that everything is fine, this is a complete approximation, so total disclaimer. The move rook takes c3 is a tactic that I've come across several times in analyzing these positions. White might be forced into b takes c3, because if you take the knight after bishop takes b4, the rook is untouchable because white gets checkmated on a1. Perhaps white could not take the rook and go like h5, but this is not the kind of thing that you want to trifle with if you're facing against Jan Nepomniachtchi. So maybe an additional prophylactic measure along the lines of bishop c1 would be required. Either way, Robert, I think we're in for a very exciting game in this one.
It's a slugfest, and I think Alireza Firouzja would want some revenge. Let's not forget that in the candidates tournament in Madrid 2022, that Alireza, he faltered against Jan Nepomniachtchi, and he famously was up all night playing bullet. That could have been part of it, but he did lose a very one-sided game. So now that we're here, this is the type of double-edged position that both of these players enjoy. As you were just highlighting, rook c8, knight b4, these attacking moves come quite naturally. And that is why white needs to combine attacking moves and defensive moves like bishop, king b1, and bishop to c1. That way you just cover your bases on the queen side, which your king happens to reside on. And then you can press forward on the king side, where it's likely the black king is going to castle to. So I love these types of positions. Alireza Firouzja, he's settled down. He is now thinking he is going to burn some clock here, because the path forward may require taking some steps back.
Yes. Well summarized, and a good look there at Alireza Firouzja yet again, Robert. Just a cornucopia of different openings. We're in for a treat as usual.
We will be right back with more from the playing hall. De Moran and Vaikunze. Do not go anywhere, because you won't want to miss any of this action from the Tata Steel Chess Tournament 2024.
It's crazy.
Oh my God. I don't feel it yet because there's so much spice already in my mouth. Turn the thermostat up. Please, no milk. No milk. No fucking milk, James. I'm gonna go to the ambulance.
What's up, everyone? Chess is hard as it is, but we're about to make it even harder by playing chili chess. For every type of piece we capture, we are gonna eat a chip with some hot sauce on it, starting with the pawns, knights, bishops, and rooks, a queen, and then the loser of the game is gonna eat this drenched chip over here.
Ready to go?
Yeah.
And here we go.
Oh man, we battled a lot in the. It's like you're letting me take it, bro. We get
Instant, you must be hungry, bro.
I'm too scared to capture.
Take it, bro.
No, because then we have to eat the.
You know what? Now you gotta eat the freaking chip.
All so big. Ah. Oh.
Yes.
Oh man. It feels like I'm inhaling a barbecue. I hate that one.
That's pretty good.
God. That is the official.
Your turn, buddy. Beautiful.
That was weird, man. It's like citrusy, but like
Correct.
kind of tastes like.
You know what? That's exactly what it would taste like.
In with the chips.
Okay. None of you back.
Nobody's drank milk yet.
Right.
All right. Word looks.
Oh. This is definitely. Turn the thermostat up.
On, mister.
Oh, you took a pawn.
Ah! No! Oh my god.
You know. Problem is, I don't feel it yet. So it's probably gonna be like how Magnus starting to creep up. I'm gonna call them people right now.
We in a ditch somewhere?
Yeah. No milk. Bro.
Bro, I can't feel my fingers.
Oh.
Same time next week?
Sure. It's a date.
Back in Vikensay, the penultimate day of action at the 2024 Tata Steel Chess Tournament. You see the town in the background, some beautiful land, beach, but it is January, so that is why everyone is indoors playing chess or watching the top sections in this play. called Demorion. You see that there are many non-professionals playing their games, equally competitive, but they have a lot at stake in the Masters section where Nodirbek Abdusattorov, the Uzbek teenager, he leads the pack 14-player field, and Nodirbek Abdusattorov stands alone in first place in the second to last round this weekend in Vaikanze. As we see our bird's eye view and all of these contestants in the playing hall, Donnie, we've had some fun openings, some action-packed starts to these games.
Indeed, and our top two boards between Gukesh and Prague there in the bottom middle, that game has more or less stabilized. It was a very exciting Nimzo Indian, but now both sides have safely tucked away their kings. We have that Benoni structure, and the second board to the left of that, Vidit versus Abdusattorov, who is, of course, in clear first place. Also, a very quiet opening. I think the outcome of the game will not be decided, in the first 7 to 8 moves. Much like Nodirbek's last few games, this one is going to enter a positional and very kind of nuanced middle game. I'm looking at Vidit's clock, though, and this has been a theme for Nodirbek. He has been up a solid 25, 30 minutes right out of the opening in a lot of these games, and this is no exception. Vidit spent a long time, Robert, on his previous move, G2, G3. And let me rewind a little bit just so we can see how we got here, because you wouldn't necessarily guess that this position came out of a Rogozin, but it did. After bishop to b4, Vidit actually transposes the game into more Nimzo Indian waters with the move e3, castles. And I kind of pointed out this line in passing. My friend Sam Shankland, he is a big believer in this bishop to d2 variation, which traditionally was not considered to be anything special, but has kind of gained quite a bit of traction recently. Nodirbek, he plays the typical move b6. We see a release of the central tension, takes, rook to c1, and bishop to e7, voluntarily dropping the bishop back. Why does Nodirbek do that? I think, Robert, maybe he is trying to dodge the possibility of an unfavorable trade of the dark squared bishops with knight to b5. Now knight b5 can be very nicely met with c6, and you don't have to trade the bishops. And in this position, Vidit, after a very long think, Vidit did it. He played the move g3. What do you make of these developments?
Well, I think G3 is aimed at stopping C5 from black, which is a very common idea in these structures. It's trying to hammer at white center, but the problem with playing C5 is that you may leave yourself with hanging pawns, just a C5 and a D5 pawn, or an isolated pawn if you ever take on D4. So if black pushes that pawn 2 squares, white fianchettos the bishop and stares at the black center, the D5 pawn can be quite vulnerable. So I think this is Vidit's idea, but black doesn't have to commit to the move C5. You can play C6 in many of these positions and adopt a more solid structure, but I believe that is the exact type of game that favors Vidit typically. He wants solid play. Maybe he'll play bishop G2, knight E5, pawn to F4, castles kingside, and just lay claim to the center.
Absolutely. And I think this increases the temptation to resolve things more concretely and play C7, C5. I would also point out, I'll draw this with arrows after C5, bishop G2. There is this very nasty looking move, bishop to A6. And maybe this is what Nodirbek will rely on to make life as difficult as possible for white. But bishop A6 is not a calamity for white. White has several ways to deal with it. For example, the move knight C3 back to E2 would cut off the diagonal and would ensure that white can castle kingside. Of course, the white king can stay in the center, but not for too long because the center is volatile. It's an unstable situation, and you do not want to play with fire. So a big decision here for Nodirbek, Robert. I agree. C7, C5, very principled, but also very committal. If you want to take less of a risk, we might see the move C6. We might see something like bishop to B7. Either way, Nodirbek needs to think long and hard about the kind of pawn structure that he wants to achieve here in the center.
This C5, bishop A6 I get it, you're stopping white from castling, but it doesn't feel like you're really playing the position. You're just playing for some tactics, preventing your opponent from castling. I feel like with white playing bishop g2 and knight e5 in those type of positions, white just dominates the center in a way that means that the white king, even if it's stuck there, isn't too unsafe. And I'm very concerned about that d5 pawn. So for Vidit Gujrathi, every move here has consequences, but he's a player who finds many great moves. He won the Grand Swiss in the Isle of Man after losing his first game. He went on a rampage, and just a day ago, he showed excellent preparation against Parham Maghsoodloo, and he found some critical moves when he needed to. We heard from Vidit Gujrathi yesterday in an interview with Fiona. Let's hear his thoughts about one of the finest moves of his career.
Vidit, congratulations. You just won your game against Parham. Let's start from the beginning. His king was suddenly on e2. What was going on there?
Thank you. And it's Parham, so it has to be like some fire on the board. I played QGD. Can you believe that this came from QGD? This is one of the good things about Parham is that he doesn't matter the tournament situation. He always goes for it. And it created a very interesting game. I was pawned down. I had sacrificed it. His king is in the center. It was total chaos. I was very proud of one move which I found, which was Queen e7, where he has just taken my knight. His rook is hanging, his bishop is hanging. And I just play like a normal move, like Queen e7, taking neither of those pieces. I think it's one of the best moves that I've ever found over the board.
Really? That's stand out.
For sure.
How did it feel to be playing it over the board?
I felt relieved because if I don't find that move, I think I'm just worse. And I was thinking for like 40 minutes, 50 minutes, trying to figure out if there's something, and I couldn't find anything. And I thought I just have a lost position. But he collapsed because
just induced.
Because he's now exchanged down and he has to probably be. I had to be precise all the way.
Gujrathi proud of his move that happened just a couple of turns from this position. So Danya, why don't you replay it for us? Because Vidit, he clearly was thrilled to uncork a quiet move in a chaotic position.
Chaotic position indeed. This is move 20. A lot happened to get to this position, but we don't have time to delve into that. In this position, Parham, with a very creative but ultimately mistaken tactic, bishop takes h6, trying to remove the defender on the f6 knight. Vidit responds by capturing on c5, and the follow-up idea by Parham, rook takes f6. It appears a bygone conclusion that black has to either take the rook or take the bishop, after which we get liquidation and a complicated position. And it is here, the commentator, forgot the name, he called black's move rather quickly. Rather than recapturing either piece, Vidit calmly drops the queen back to e7, an incredible move. And suddenly it turns out that white is dealing with irresolvable problems. The rook is hanging, and if it drops back to f3, this might be something that Parham overlooked. The bishop comes out to g4, and everything collapses. e4 combined with gh, and bishop takes f3. There are too many threats. White loses material. Parham was forced to give up the exchange. Vidit didn't even rush to capture it, and a flawless conversion later, he emerged victorious. An amazing win by Vidit with the black pieces, and his momentum continues. Back we go, though, to the current round. Vidit with a very complicated opening against the tournament leader, Noterbeck, a game that Vidit really wants to try to press, and knight b to d7. Totally reasonable move by Noterbeck. I think he is following your advice, Robert. He is not rushing with c5. I think he is going to situate his pawn on c6, and maybe he will still play bishop a6 in response to bishop g2. We'll see.
And the bishop was just developed there from Vidit Gujrathi, who's in fine form. We saw his win yesterday, but he's lost 0 games in Vaikonze. You won't see any games where he went down to defeat. In fact, I can hardly think of a game where he was worse, Danya. He has a very steady approach to chess. He likes to play solid moves and then try to outplay his opponent, but he's not afraid to muddy the waters and get tactical, as he just displayed yesterday against Parham. So Queen E7, that retreating move that we just went over against Parham yesterday, it's much easier to spot when you have an engine to the side suggesting black is much better, if not winning. But to come up with that concept over the board, that takes a lot of calculation and hard work. And speaking of hard work, Donna, you always put in some good work. And bishop a6, that bishop is doing some heavy lifting. It is preventing the white king from castling. For those of you who are newer to chess and watching this broadcast, you cannot castle through or into check. That bishop, it covers f1. No castling available for white.
And if only you'd told me that earlier, I mean, I think that really would have revolutionized my chess career. Man, and here I was trying to make all these illegal moves. Now, bishop a6 is the kind of move that, if it works out, fantastic. This is exactly what you want. But it also looks very flimsy to play this move, having not preliminarily pushed c6, because it just feels like some of these light squares on the queen side are kind of weak. The bishop itself is quite vulnerable. One of white's top candidate moves is definitely queen d1 to a4, and maybe we'll see Noterbeck hopping into d3, which is a surprisingly safe square, kind of in amongst the trees, and yet it's very, very hard to actually smoke that bishop out of there. This, Robert, could get very, very tactical, especially if white drops in a knight on e5. We get liquidation in the center. Noterbeck, I think, trusting his intuition here. He played the move bishop a6 quite quickly. I don't think he did too much calculation to get to this position. I think he's trusting in the fact that because white is uncastled, the tactical complications ultimately should favor him. Whether he's right or not, I really don't know. And if Vidit doesn't want to engage in any of this, he can still play the move knight to e2, but that just seems a little bit insipid.
Yeah, that's toothless. I'm going to be honest. I think bishop a6 is a mistake. I'm looking at this position, and if we can just do a little bit of analysis here, after queen a4, it's a direct hit on the bishop on a6. And you can defend that bishop with a move like queen to c8. You, of course, can retreat your bishop to b7. But why would you invite the white queen to a4? That's a square it often wants to go to anyway. So queen c8 looks out of the question because of all sorts of ideas like knight e5. Bishop d3, if you put that one on the board, I think knight e5 still is going to hurt because that knight hits the bishop on d3. And Vidit, by the way, just played queen a4.
Great call.
And if you take this knight on e5, after d takes e5, down goes your d5 pawn, the bishop on g2, the knight on c3, and if you play knight to e4, I think all sorts of queen d4 ideas will be good in these positions, but I can just win the pawn on e4. Why do I even have to get tactical? Let me just take on e4 a bunch of times and say, I'm a pawn to the good.
But there is this b5 trick that black might have. If you take twice on e4, I think b5 might secure the piece, right? Takes, and b5 is a vicious little trap.
So your highlights tricked me. See, I saw you, throwing arrows and hovering over the square, so I thought that would be okay. But a queen d4, to my eyes,
I faked you out. You're absolutely right, Robert. Queen d4 is actually a high-class move. Look at that, just sticking the queen in the center. And knight takes e3, I think you want to play queen takes e3, or actually queen d3, knight a2 with complete chaos on the board. Maybe just bishop takes c3. I'm not totally sure here.
Bishop c3 was my follow-up because now the d5 pawn is loose. You could play bishop c4, but I played b3, and I just finally kick your bishop out of there, and d5 does, in fact, drop. White goes a pawn ahead. The white king is not in any danger just because it can't castle.
What a line, and what an important detail. This knight to e5 knight sally comes just at the right moment. So bishop d3, very flashy. It makes a lot of noise, but ultimately it's refuted. Now, wait a second. Noterbeck is pausing after queen to a4. Obviously, he saw this move. There's not a chance that he missed queen a4, but maybe he missed a detail such as bishop d3, knight e5. And if he's overlooked something, he might be forced to drop his bishop back to b7, and that would be not a catastrophic, but a rather annoying loss of tempo, Robert, because the queen is a major asset, and white would be able to castle kingside, and then Vidit would get a clear, I think, objective edge. Okay, now, has Noterbeck rushed into this? Has he played a little bit too quickly?
Yes, haste makes waste, and I think he just wasted a very important tempo by playing bishop to a6, because if you're going to retreat to b7, already white can think about preventing black from adopting the c6 setup. Let's actually dive in a little bit. And actually, before bishop to a6 was played, let's talk about what bishop happens in this position with bishop to b7. That you're going to play bishop b7, and then you could play c6 or c5, depending on your flavor. But c6 is an important stabilizing move. c5 is a more aggressive move. So if we go to the game for a second, after queen a4, if you have wasted a tempo just to retreat back to b7, can't I play knight e5 and stop you from playing c6? Knight c6, by the way, is a kind of threat. Knight takes d7 will net me a pawn. And if you take my knight on e5 and I just capture back on e5, your knight can't really go back to d7 because the pawn on d5 is loose in these positions.
And g4 is laterally controlled by the queen. This is such a common blunder at lower levels, missing these lateral control over a square like g4. Now, where does black go here? Knight d7, knight takes d5, knight c5, trying to get out of it tactically. No, that's unlikely to work. Knight e8. I mean, I really don't want to play a move like this, but you kind of might have to. But Robert, here, I mean, white doesn't even have to hurry castles, rook fd1, maybe even drop the bishop back to e1. The eval bar is relatively modest here. Maybe there is a tactical way to kind of jailbreak out of black's problems. I'm really not sure what it is, though. Let's try knight d7.
Knight takes d5?
And maybe knight c5.
But I thought that I could just centralize my queen after knight c5. So the point is that the queen on a4 is under attack and knight d3 check is a threat. So I'm going to deal with both at once by centralizing my queen to d4. And as you see, the evaluation suggests that white is ahead.
Aha, but maybe knight takes e5?
Oh, wow.
How about them apples?
But this continues. Right? Queen e4 is one idea.
Ooh.
Bishop, of course, can take the rook on a8. I wouldn't go for that. But yeah, queen e4. How does this survive for black?
c6?
See, now we're getting into like you're giving away a pawn. Why can't I just take this pawn if I want it?
Take me, I would.
Okay, so this is some deep lines where there is a saving grace with knight d3 check, but if I take on e5 and you take this bishop on d5, black does have an isolated pawn in these positions. I know you might throw in some kind of bishop f6 at some moment just to scare me, but this is a better position for white, even if the evaluation is hovering towards the center. White has the clear plus.
Absolutely, and I played queen takes d5. Probably that's inaccurate, but I just want to illustrate that white has the c-file, black has the isolani on d5. And I know that we just went very deeply, but honestly, I'm glad we did, Robert, because that was a really cool line. And that shows us two things. First of all, how quickly things can get tactical the moment you're kind of lulled to sleep and you think, this is going to be a long maneuvering game. No. The moment a knight lands on e5, things start to explode. Second of all, this is not unlikely. Of course, all of this is predicated on Noterbeck dropping the bishop back to b7 and kind of admitting defeat in this narrow sense. But if that happens, then we absolutely could get this entire line, because knight e5 is the principled attempt to punish black for this loss of tempo.
I think it's the only attempt, because bishop b7, let's say white castles and just plays it safe. Then black does establish the pawn on c6. And in some of these positions, black even plays a5 and b5 and knight to b6. The bishop on b7, it's not a great piece, but you love to say, Adanya, that bad bishops defend good pawns. That c6 pawn is clutch. It's defending the d5 pawn and stopping any piece for white from getting to the b5 square, allowing black instead to push a pawn and gain some much-needed space for his pieces.
And in a weird way, this would make Noterbeck look like a genius, as if he induced queen a4. It was all deliberate to begin with, because now the move b5 comes with tempo. So the effect of the queen on a4 is rather minimized in this case. So I agree. Bishop b7, knight e5 is very likely, and we will keep an eagle eye on this position, particularly if they start going down this concrete line, as we see Noterbeck kind of just calming himself down there, taking a sip of water, and he's doing the right thing. He understands that clearly he overlooked something. Clearly he underestimated queen a4, so he needs to kind of rebuild himself mentally and jump into the calculation.
This is psychologically very difficult when you develop a piece to a square and the objective best follow up is to retreat it, not because you've gained anything, but because you've actually missed something. So for Nurdirbek Abdusattorov, I think he's in a tough spot. You start going through those thoughts of, oh, is it happening again? Last year I was in first place, had good chances, and then I lost in the final round. Here I'm in first place. I played a solid setup. I was ahead on the clock, but I rushed my decision, and now I'm going to have to retreat with bishop to b7, c95 occur. And if he has a way out, that would be quite fortunate for him, because I don't think this was planned at all.
I agree. I think we've done a good summary of the kinds of things that are circling around Noterbek's head, but he's got plenty of time. He's got a 20-plus minute time advantage. There's no need to hurry and panic, and maybe we should hurry over to some of the other boards. Maybe we can go back to the bird's eye view. We've got some exciting developments on some of the other boards. Jan Nepomniachtchi making his intentions very clear, jumping to b4 with his knight and trying to provoke Alireza into pushing a3. And then I think he's just going to drop his knight back to c6 and use that a3 pawn as a hook. So that game continues to heat up. Our second marquee matchup between Gukesh and Pragg, I mentioned that it kind of has stabilized into a somewhat quieter middle game than I expected, but that's not to say there isn't action on that board. There most certainly is, Robert. And there's a couple of games that we haven't looked at yet, such as Ju and Jun versus Wei Yi, where the queens are now off the board, and Danchenko versus Parham, which is actually a lot more tactical than it looks.
Okay, so we have our options. We're spoiled for choice. Why don't we go to our matchup between Gukesh and Praggnanandhaa? Just because if Nurdirbek has gone wrong and Gukesh can win his game, we will have a new leader in this tournament. We promise that we will get to the other games.
Yes.
In particular, that Ju and Jun Wei Yi game is quite deep into it in an endgame. But look at this position, Danya. The light square bishops have been traded. There's a white queen on f5. What do you make of this? The bishop on b4, to my eyes, that's now stranded. It was pinning a knight on c3. Could have captured at any moment. That bishop on b4, it's playing on the wrong side of the board.
Yeah, that bishop on b4, it came late to the party. Right? It came to the party 4 hours after the last attendee left, and there's, empty pizza boxes, and the living room is trashed, and there's nothing going on the queen side anymore. So from that perspective, I like what I see from Gukesh. I like the way that he has situated his queen on f5, exerting pressure together with the bishop on h4. But with all of that said, I'm not sure that white has any concrete threats. For example, I don't really see anything wrong with an expansion move like b7, b5, just kind of playing this in kind of the style of a Benoni. But, I mean, maybe you could play bishop a5, bishop c7, and try to find somewhat more suitable arrangements for the bishop. Not that it's all that good on c7. So I'm having a bit of a hard time finding a move here for Pragg. I think his position is harder to play from a practical standpoint, and he's also down 40 minutes on the clock.
This is deeply uncomfortable for him. And there's a knight on e2, so I'm wondering, is that knight going to try to jump forward to h5 to pile up pressure on the pin piece? A move like g5 from black, it may be okay, according to the engine, but you have two major issues to worry about. One is an immediate piece sacrifice, blowing open your king side. The other is the long-term hole on f5. The queen currently resides on f5, but if a knight hops into f5, you might just be lost on the spot. So the type of move, or the type of, I think, courage it takes to play a move like g5, you have to spend quite a bit of time, and Praggnanandhaa's already way down on the clock.
Yes, and you're right. G5 it kind of reeks of desperation. Well, not desperation, but that's the wrong way to put it. If you're playing a move like g5, you have to be 100% sure that it works out objectively. And I actually think, while the situation is not desperate, Robert, I think you have to go g7, g5. I think it's a great call by you, because if you procrastinate and you play a couple of slow moves and white gets a knight to h5, then all of a sudden white's got this vice-like grip on black's position. And perhaps this is what Pragg is now taking over 10 minutes to calculate. G7 to g5. trying to establish a knight on e4 and ultimately to smoke this incredibly annoying queen out of f5.
I think now or never with respect to g5, because let's say I make some sort of passing move like queen e7,
Okay.
very normal looking
Sure.
move. Knight g3, you're not playing g5 now, not with a knight about to step into the f5 square. I think I'm sacrificing immediately on g5. I have trapped my own bishop after all, and once I take with check, the knight jumps into f5, and queen g7 is going to be checkmate.
Lovely illustration. Knight g3 is a very instructive move for newer players who might reject this. Don't automatically reject moves just because g5 traps the bishop. Remember that you can sack on g5, and if you have sufficient firepower on the king side, you can make these sacrifices work. And what does black do here? Well, if black continues to kind of pass the turn with b5, I don't think this is necessarily terrible for black. But yeah, knight h5, maybe not here because of queen to e4. This is a resource to keep in mind. Robert, knight h5, I think black solves all of his problems with queen to e4. But I don't know what comes to mind for you. Maybe expanding in the center with a move like e3, e4 can be considered. And now setting up all sorts of tactics. Okay, maybe you can flick in a3. But I think people understand the point. If white can get a knight to g3, the bind on black's position starts to grow. So let's consider g5 for a second. Is a sacrifice on g5 totally out of the question here?
Absolutely not. That would scare me, but perhaps white doesn't have enough firepower and not enough to follow up with. But taking on g5 with either piece looks quite adventurous.
Maybe rook e5
Ooh. So
is an important intermezzo.
That's a really instructive point.
Bishop takes, pawn takes is forced. Yeah, this is not sufficient.
Well, the engine says it's not sufficient, but Danya, if you were playing this in a game, would you feel that confident that your king is safe?
No. I mean, I wouldn't feel confident that my king is safe against Gukesh, even if he had no pieces on the king side. In a bullet brawl, give me white any day of the week, particularly Saturday. In a classical game, okay, after king h8, I just hate this resource knight h7, right? This is what makes it so annoying to try to attack. If you give a check on h6, and maybe you should give a check on h6, after knight h7, you should probably just like pick up a third pawn. But already, oh, look at this. Knight e5, knight takes e5 is actually a terrible blunder because of knight takes f7. Okay, so there is meat on the bone, but I really don't see Gukesh going for something like this.
And knight to f6, if you just play it quietly here, then the queens are going to come off. Otherwise, the other knight to f6, sorry. Yeah, the d5 pawn drops. So you have 3 pawns for your piece, but you're actually losing one of them by 4. So 2 pawns is not enough to fully compensate the sacrifice piece. So I'm with you that you have to calculate all of these sacrifices on g5, but it doesn't look like white has a sufficient follow-up because you don't have enough attackers. Bishop can drop back to g3, and now there is this permanent hole on f5. The queen is tucked away in enemy territory, and as you're pointing out, h4 becomes a pretty nasty idea that black has to contend with because g5 is overextended.
Indeed. And Prague, after a long think, he has gone at the other side of the board. He's not played the move g5. He's played a different pawn move. And he's played the move c5, c4. Okay, things are really starting to heat up in a big way. Now, you see the move c4 in a Benoni pretty frequently. Usually it is associated, Robert, with the idea of carving out a path for the knight from d7 to drop into d3. But here specifically, I don't really think that's the immediate idea. I think the knight is going to remain on d7 for the immediate future to protect its counterpart on f6. I think Prague is just trying to grab some space, maybe push b7, b5, and pass the ball back into Gukesh's kind of court.
I'm trying to figure out how white should continue because the move knight g3 still comes to mind. At some point, black can move this queen out of the pin. The knight on d7, knight on f6, they are defending one another. So if knight g3 is about to happen and maybe some further jumps in the position, perhaps queen a5 suddenly is an annoying idea, hitting this loose pawn on d5 that white needs to take care of.
Wow, that's a great find. Queen a5 is an additional resource created by this move c4. So maybe for Gukesh, I mean, there's so many micro decisions that you have to make. First of all, I keep harping on this, but maybe now is the time to throw in a3, particularly in light of queen a5. Maybe you force black's bishop to make a decision, either dropping back to a5 or c5. And if after a3 the bishop drops back to c5, then that square is taken away from the knight. Your own knight from e2 can then move up to c3, and you can start slowly preparing the central expansion. So it's a very hard position to handle for both sides. That's the way that I would describe it. Probably white's position is objectively preferable by a hair.
I just think that your description, the way you said micro decisions, and that is really what this position is about. Do you throw in rook c1 and maybe rook c8? Do you have that inclusion? Do you play a3 first? Do you move your knight from e2 to g3? Do you move your rook from f1 to d1? Where do your pieces belong? It's not an easy question to answer. Both of these players, they're full of ideas. It's a rich position. Many pieces remain. But where exactly your pieces belong, at what exact time, not so easy to figure out. So, Daniel, I'm with you. Whether or not to include a3, difficult question. Whether to include rook c1 or not easy to answer. So I'm posing the questions because this, everyone, is how you should think about the games. What do you gain from each decision? And now that I'm saying it, Daniel, just one quick note that rook c1, you can just draw with an arrow, and black plays rook c8. Now after a3, you no longer have bishop c5. So that is something that you might want to consider, because the bishop goes to a5 rather than c5. It's a more passive diagonal, or at least it's less centralized.
Another move you could consider here is b3, fighting fire with fire, just trying to get rid of the c4 pawn. So this is where having all of that time on the clock, 90 plus minutes, is going to be very, very helpful. There's multiple ways of approaching this. You can trust your intuition and play quickly. I don't think Gukesh is going to do that, and I think that affords us a good opportunity to keep going around the horn. We have a really interesting development in our top game between Vidit and Noterbeck, where Noterbeck has made perhaps a somewhat questionable decision. He has dropped his bishop in to c4, but Robert, I know there's other games that we haven't looked at yet. Of course, we have to spend the vast majority of our time on the games with the most direct impact on the top of the tournament standings, but we can check out this bishop c4 move, unless there is a game that you think we should visit first.
No, I think we should visit Vidit, because this game is of the utmost importance. Well, this decision from Noterbeck doesn't surprise me, and I think I don't want to say it's strictly based on age, but when you're a fierce competitor and a fearless one like Noterbeck Abdusattorov, sometimes you don't want to take a step back. You want to push forward, come up with the active tries. You don't want to sit in a passive position and maybe have to defend for an eternity. So in bishop to c4, why can't White just play b3 here and kick the bishop out? The bishop has to go to d3. And then we're back where we started, with the knight coming to e5, and the d5 pawn feels very loose.
And does the move b3 have any impact on the position? You have to ask this question all the time. Maybe black at some point has bishop b7 to a3. Let's investigate. So b3 is definitely the big move. Now, briefly, I considered b5. That doesn't work. I can just play knight takes b5, knight b6 there. The queen can slide up to a5. So bishop d3 is, as Yasser likes to say, box, which means forced move. Box is the symbol, the chess symbol for a forced move in the old chess informant magazines. And now I believe our move was knight e5, Robert. Knight takes e5, pawn takes e5. Again, we go down the rabbit hole here with knight e4. And now queen to d4, I think, was the resource that causes the most problems for black. And I'm here to report that the presence of the pawn on b3, okay, bishop a3 looks very flashy, but it loses immediately to queen takes bishop. I don't think it fundamentally changes the nature of the position. I think black is in big trouble here, unless I'm missing something.
You're not missing anything. I believe that Noterbeck came up with a bad plan, and it was an understandable one, to put his bishop on a6 to stop white from castling. But the follow-up with queen a4 was very natural. And then bishop to c4, as he played in the game, he is tunneled, is Noterbeck, on this plan to be active, to not just sit passively, and he has gone wrong. So it's unfortunate for the youngster from Uzbekistan, who has been so close to winning this tournament last year, and now has been leading for the last few rounds this year. But Vidit Guzrati, he doesn't mind coming back from a position that may seem like he's got no chance to win a tournament. He showed that the world he could do it in the Isle of Man. He's doing it right now. No, he is not sleeping. He is calculating. And this player, he is an absolute beast. He's someone who's on the rise, maybe more than pretty much anyone on the planet right now. He may not be a teenager anymore, but Vidit Gujrathi, he's young. He is feeling fresh, and he has a chance to take the advantage. So we'll leave him to it. And when we return, we are going to see more action from the 2024 Tata Steel Chess Tournament. We'll be right back, everyone. Don't miss a beat.
Scheveningen, yeah? It's called Scheveningen, okay.
Scheveningen, I guess. Scheveningen?
Scheveningen.
You beat Magnus Carlsen? Okay, yeah, probably not. But what if we give him a few distractions? Can you beat Magnus while he's cooking? What if he's playing football? How about Magnus skiing? Surely you can beat him sleeping. Now there's a Magnus for everyone. This month on chess.com.
Do you do shitty push-ups?
No, I'll be fine.
So I could like drop down and do 10 on move 1?
Well, yeah, we start the clock and then you just decide when you want to do that.
All right.
Wait, are we...
Look at the form! Look at the shoes! We got a clown with the shoes!
How many did you do?
Get the shoes!
Wait, what does that mean?
Yo! Levy! What's up? What's up? I'm fit as f***. What you got this way? Bobby's got game too! Oh man, I gotta take off my shirt. I gotta take off my shirt. Alright. We need an arbiter for your count. Yeah, oh, here we go. We should have run. There you go, okay, good. It's actually not the 5-3 is a big format, I feel like.
Okay, now we're tied. We're tied. Okay. Oh, he's trying to get a lead. He's at 31.
In that late night
These pieces are crazy, man. That's okay. I'm not trying to do.
All right, so that was a really good lesson for me. That little pattern.
This is how you learn that.
Yeah, there's good.
Oh, we made 3 move push-ups.
My check was fine, but taking the reverse was stupid. But if I took the 9.
More push-ups.
Oh, I have to play faster.
3 minute is.
Yeah, he could just do that though. It was a cool move. But it was a bad move.
Alright, I got it for 3 minutes.
At least I did my push-ups. Oh, what a tragic way to end the game.
So we've got the.
Long enough break.
In the heart of the Netherlands, where tradition meets innovation, the battleground is set. Welcome one and all to the Tata Steel Chess Tournament, the Wimbledon of chess. The stage is graced by the finest strategists, the sharpest minds, and the most formidable opponents from around the globe.
H5, we are in for a fight.
A mix of seasoned veterans and rising stars will make sure this edition of Tata Steel will be spectacular.
And checkmate. Nordbeck played a brilliant game. He is a monster.
World champion Dingley Ren makes a return to the board after being absent in chess for over half a year. How will he fare against the defending champion Anish Giri and those who have already secured their spot in the FIDE Candidates Tournament?
To beat Ding with the form that Ding has been displaying is absolutely impressive.
Under the watchful eye of thousands of chess fans visiting the venue daily, 14 chess maestros will vie for supremacy title.
As we return to Vaikunze, the windy conditions outside have seemed to seep into the playing hall, as some of the players, they seem to be off balance, Danya. Nordbeck of Dusatara in particular. He's been leading this event. He entered today in clear first, but it seems he's lost his footing somewhat against Vidit Gujrati.
Yeah, we're only 90 minutes in, and just a quick shout out as to how much of an honor it is to commentate this penultimate round of this incredibly prestigious event. You can just smell the tension in the air, Robert. And Nordbeck, his play, it smacks of panic. He's panicked, he missed Queen A4, and he's overreacted, and it is not an exaggeration to say that he is in huge trouble out of the opening.
He's in huge trouble. He's human. He's young. There's so much great chess ahead of him, but he doesn't want to keep hearing the future. He wants this tournament right here, right now, but he has gone wrong against Vidit Gujrati. So we'll just show you quickly what that position looks like, because not much has changed, but he has decided to move forward with his bishop. He first brought out to A6, then he brings it into C4, but this was mistaken.
Yeah, and Vidit will not miss a move as straightforward as B3. It looks a little bit claustrophobic, like maybe the queen gets trapped somewhere, but concretely, Black has no resources and the bishop's scope is limited. It has to drop into D3. And as you very quickly pointed out, we looked at this line without the inclusion of the move B3. And before the break, we determined that the move B3 does not substantively change anything. Bishop D3 on the board. And I am expecting a quick knight jump to e5, Robert. There's going to be a trade, and perhaps the move that Noterbeck missed is actually queen a4 to d4. I could make a case for that because it's very easy to assume after knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight e4, that white's only reasonable option is to take twice on e4, and we know that that actually loses to the intermezzo b5.
But Danya, the problem for Noterbeck is that Vidit's moves are a bit obvious. You see him already ready to gallop that knight into e5, and there it goes. So once we continue down this path, the bishop on d3 is currently under attack. The d5 pawn is threatened by two of white's pieces and only defended by one of black's. Knight c6 would hurt you a lot if you are Noterbeck. So you kind of have to take this knight on e5. And once we see the trade of knights on e5, queen d4 actually isn't that hard to spot in the moment. You don't need the evaluation bar off the side to help you out there. I think Vidit, his brain will do the work, and with the queen sliding into d4, I'm very worried for Noterbeck Abdusattorov.
Yeah, well, this is infuriating because queen d4 is essentially an only move. Because once you determine that knight takes e4 and bishop takes e4 literally loses the game, Vidit is not going to miss b5. And really tempted to make the Russian language pun here because, again, Vidit means he or she sees. So when I say he sees everything in reference to Vidit, that kind of hits different for a Russian speaker. But queen d4, there is nothing else to do. And I'm actually struggling to find even a way to get a playable position for black after queen d4. I think we've established that black loses at least a pawn. I think the best that Noterbeck can do, and this just illustrates the extent to which he has messed up here, is, okay, I was going to put this on the analysis board. I don't think we have to because we're going to see all of this being played momentarily. Gee, I wonder what Vidit's going to do here. I think he needs to slow down. Man, that was way too quick, Robert. Evaluate the candidate moves, Vidit. Come on. And look at the convergence of the crowd. Donchenko, now the world champion. These top GMs, they're just like vultures. They know where the blood is being spilled. They just have a sixth sense for it.
And they are going to watch Vidit circle around this d5 pawn. First, he'll bring his queen into d4, but that pawn is not long for this board. And let's say black continues with knight e4. I think that was going to be what you were going to recommend, that you can throw away the pawn in the center of the board, and then we will see a series of forced trades after knight takes d3, bishop takes bishop e4 here. And let's say these pieces come off on e4. White has this harmonious setup, and it's kind of like white has two extra pawns while black also has an extra pawn. Black has an extra c pawn, but white has two extra pawns on the king side, and I actually think that's very promising for Vidit's winning chances as compared to just having one extra pawn that's otherwise symmetrical. So I think the two extra pawns on the king side allow him to, as you pointed out, to go for an attack against the black king.
This is borderline technically winning, which is not to suggest that it would be an easy conversion. Noterbeck, we know how he fights. He will fight tooth and nail to stay in this game as long as possible. But Vidit, with close to an hour on his clock, I mean, he is an amazing positional player. I feel like he has it in himself to convert a position like this, especially given the psychological pain of getting this kind of position out of the opening as the tournament leader. This is not what Noterbeck was planning. Now, maybe, Robert, if we rewind a little bit, maybe bishop e4 is not the most practical option. You can also drop the bishop back, but at this point, you're choosing between several, disgusting options. Bishop to g6 maybe can be tried instead. Okay, of course, e6, bishop f6 is unnecessary. I think white should just snag the pawn on d5. What would you take it with here? Would you take it with the bishop, or would you take it with the queen and force the trade?
I think I would take it with the bishop. This is going to sound strange, but I was also considering moves like h4 just to try to go for an attack. I thought the pawn on d5 isn't really going anywhere, so if I can include h4 and h5, I thought that was favorable for white. But either way, I was going to take with the bishop on d5 and just say that your rook on a8's loose. e6 becomes even more annoying now, and we may just see a position that the queens come off the board and white has to prove that he can win this endgame.
Yeah, and that will be a completely different stage of the game. A very heavy advantage. I mean, white is up a pawn and also has the counter. for your piece placement. Noterbeck is not the impression that it's the only feasible move. I mean, maybe he's after knight takes d5, that just looks, unless you can somehow try to get, I'm really not by knight d7, but I think we're going to see.
And he may have overlooked his queen, but now that we're here, he sees it. Leave Noterbeck. We of course will come back. This is a marquee matchup. You can catch him. Vidit Gujarati may first if Gukesh doesn't win, and we will finally. So much tension for the evaluation bar is quite high. Bishop next to his king, so he followed that branch game. And black pieces against Ju and Jun, because if Wei Noterbeck, he'll catch up to him.
So my proposal, let's take a look at that endgame in Jun versus Wei, and then a pretty clear advantage. And you're absolutely right. If Vidit is able to convert this clear advantage against Noterbeck and win the game, it's going to be the Wild West out there. Wei is cheering for Vidit, and that might open the door for a player like Wei to rise to the top of the tournament standings, particularly with 2 consecutive wins. This is suddenly getting a whole lot more exciting. Okay, so this was a Dutch. Wei paying homage to the host country here with a Stonewall Dutch. The queens were traded pretty early on, and that doesn't mean the game is any less exciting. This is as unbalanced, unstable as a queenless middle game can get, Robert.
Well, speaking of a stable, that horsey on h3,
it's very good. Okay, that was really good.
Thank you, my friend. What is it doing over there? Like, usually you want to bring your pieces to the center. That knight is on the rim, and I know we're going way back in time. We keep talking about the opening, so maybe we should just go through the moves and talk about some of the plans, because that knight went to h3 very early on in this game, as soon as move 5, and it never left.
I'm unstable to do that, Robert. Sorry. Okay, just kidding. It did go to h3 on move 5. I listened to what you said, I promise. I was not just thinking of that pun. I'm not just horsing around.
Oh, look at you. You're a natural Bojack over there. So we see that the White King castles, and you would assume that the knight on h3 went there so you could put it on f4 or bishop on f4, but neither of those moves happened. Instead, Ju decided to play on the queen side, and here is where he decided to strike, because as White's hanging about a little bit, and so he takes on c4, opening up that light square fianchetto bishop. So a very committal decision, not one you take lightly. And now he strikes the center because White hasn't developed the queen side, and then knight is on h3 rather than centralized on f3, which means that it feels like prime time to strike.
I mean, this feels extremely dubious for black. You don't see this type of idea at all in the Stonewall, but Wei clearly trying to burn his bridges and take risks out of the opening. It's backfired for several players. Ali Reza Firouzja tried that. He lost. Barham Maksudlu was at death's door. Jun is just not someone that you can, just like artificially manufacture winning chances against with black. But Wei seems to have stabilized. Knight c6, bishop b2, queen b6, queen b3. Computer criticizes the move, maybe not the most principled approach. This leads to that queen trade, takes. Okay, knight takes d4 actually could have been considered, but I actually think the knight gets trapped on e2 at the end of the line. And so instead, the knight goes the other way, inviting the queen trade on black's terms. Rook c1 protecting the pawn, bishop d7 completing the development. Knight to d2, white completes her development. And all this time, Robert, the knight is still chilling on h3. And bishop f1, rook c7. Clearly, the battle is revolving around this c4 pawn. Black is concentrating all of his efforts as much as possible on exerting maximum pressure on this pawn. Knight b3 by Jun. Get off me, she says to the knight on a5. Wei says, okay. Drops back to, rook a8, sorry. f3, drops back to c6. And I quite like the trend of the game, which I think favors black.
Yes, I do as well, but there's one little move. If you go back a few turns when black put a rook on c8, this is the one question mark I have, is why did he bring the a8 rook to c8 rather than the f8 rook? Because if I were playing a bullet brawl, like will happen later today, I would definitely be swinging the f8 rook over to the queen side, because that rook on a8, it's on an open line towards white's position. So it's maybe there's a little nuance here that rook needed to stay over on the king side. But I was just wondering because that rook ended up on a8. So the rooks kind of swapped files a bit.
Yes, I agree. Maybe he was worried about some tactical possibility of, I don't know, bishop to c3 here. But I agree. I mean, black has the tempo that he would need to bring the rook up to c7. So I'm with you. A slightly puzzling moment there, but perhaps doesn't have too much of an impact on the evaluation. Feels to me, though, that Jun is playing this a little bit too passively. And after the knight has dropped back to c6, what are some of black's active ideas here? Well, e5, of course, is an incredibly committal move. I don't know if black's ready for it. I don't know if he even particularly wants to play e5. From Jun's perspective, I think it might be time to involve this knight on h3 in the game. It's just been a passive spectator. Maybe it can drop back to f2 and ideally circle forward to d3, but it feels like Wei Yi is preparing something very nefarious against knight f2.
It's a great word. It's not exactly clear where he's going to angle in from, but as you mentioned, e5 is one idea. Bishop a3 is another, because if the dark square bishops get traded, there are many holes in white's camp and the b4 square. You might double your rooks on the a file. So black's pawn structure, optically, it looks worse. You've doubled isolated b pawns, but they're doing important work. One is when you have double pawns, you have open files, the A and the C file. So the black's rooks are more active than their counterparts, because white's rooks are defending, black's rooks are attacking. Black has squares to jump to, knight b4, bishop a3. White doesn't, because those rooks are passive. So black is actually quite solid. The foundation is sturdy. And now it's about trying to teeter white's foundation, because you see the a2 pawn, there's a rook, a 5-point piece, defending a 1-point piece. That's not good usage of your heavy pieces. So you are looking at this position, trying to create inroads. e5 is one, bishop a3 is another. I'm not sure where you come from if you're Wei Yi, but I think you just try to keep it a bit ambiguous to force Jun to make difficult decisions.
Well said, Robert. I think bishop a3, you highlighted, is a major positional idea, engineering long-term pressure on this a2 pawn, which perhaps makes it more appealing for white to push a4. But then the pawn has a weakness on a4. So if I had to make a prediction here, how is the game going to continue? It's hard to say, but I think Jun might try to address the issue of her knight. Maybe even knight h3 to f4 is a better way to do it. Inviting black to trade on f4, that leads to a unbalanced pawn structure of its own. So very strategically complex endgame. It's at once a tactical position, but it's not like there's concrete tactics going on right now. There's just a very high probability that this game explodes into kind of hand-to-hand combat at some point in the near future. Very interesting position. This is a game to watch.
Queens are off the board, but so are the gloves. They're off because this is a fighting position. It's not just an end game where you're playing for a
I love that analogy.
Pass on there. Thank you. But I'm looking at this position. It's a queenless middle game where both sides have different pluses and minuses. The knight on h3, it's offside. Knight f4, it's an idea that I never would have thought of, but perhaps you can justify it ruining your own pawn structure to secure the bishop pair. So Jun has tough choices ahead of her. Wei Yi is behind on the clock, so I think that she's doing well. The position remains balanced, but it's not the type of balance where there's a clear path towards a draw. Both sides will have to play superb chess to hold on here. I think it's easier to play for black, but Jun, she is now head on the board, quite literally trying to determine what to do next.
I don't think her head can sink any lower, just trying to get different angles here. Different view of the position. Sometimes that can inspire you. That can help you acquire a deeper understanding. And speaking of acquiring a deeper understanding, shall we now investigate that Firouzja Nepo position? Because I want an understanding of why the eval bar is so overwhelmingly in Alireza's favor. And I know the eval bar is partial to Alireza. He's a great guy, but what about Black's position is so rotten in the state of Nepo? Well, the last move was queen to b6. This is that Jababa London if you're just joining. I was going to say opposite side castling, but Black hasn't castled yet. He is very likely to in the near future, but for the time being, the king is stranded in the center. And I think we've got a funny photo, Robert. Remember that this game didn't start with d4. It started with the Van Geet opening one knight c3. And Jan Nepo wears his emotions on his sleeve, literally. We can see that here, Anamaya capturing that funny moment.
Jan is like, what? Is this real life? And shout out to Anamaya. If you don't follow her streams, please go give her a follow. She's fantastic. But she's also on site covering this action. And that is a great photo of Jan Nepomniachtchi. Like, what is this? Are you really playing this against me? Super Grandmaster, 2-time candidates winner, 2-time runner-up in the World Championship, Jan Nepomniachtchi. The answer is absolutely. And it's worked to perfection.
Yeah, I mean, that is just not a move that you see frequently. You know, I'm a little bit surprised, given Jan's sense of humor, that he didn't respond to knight c3 with knight c6, which actually is a pretty decent move. That reminds me of a story. I can tell it really, really quickly if we have a second. Sam Shankland told me this story. It concerns Vishy Anand. Vishy, I've told this story before in a commentary, but the story goes that Vishy was giving a lecture to a bunch of dignitaries. He was receiving an award. And as part of the ceremony, one of the top dignitaries at the ceremony was to play an exhibition game with Vishy on the demonstration board that would be visible to all. Except this particular muckety muck did not really know the rules of the game. And so on the first move, he lifts his b1 knight and puts it on e4, knight b1 to e4. Now, Vishy doesn't want to make him look bad and call out the illegal move. So Vishy, classy man that he is, gets his b8 knight and puts it on e5, knight b8 to e5. Very fun opening.
Well, Vishy, the world champion, you can do those things when you have that crown. But that is a hilarious story. And honestly, just, it's a great to hear Vishy, he's always so generous, but to kind of make an illegal move just to make sure that person didn't feel uncomfortable. That's a very kind gesture. And, well, we look at these two players here, Alireza and Jan Nepomniachtchi. It looks like we've got that pylon cam. Jan, he's up, walking about. But this last move that he's played, queen to b6, it earned a question mark. It was given that from, Chess.com's game review here. But It has a clear purpose. It attacks the d4 pawn and pins the b2 pawn. So it feels like it's an attacking move just in a moment when your king is stuck in the center.
Now let's get one thing out of the way. Bishop takes a3 is actually not a threat. This is a known trap in these Jababa positions because, okay, let me take a random move just for the sake of illustration. I'm not saying h5 is best, although it might be. Bishop takes a3, runs into knight to a4. Again, these lateral attacking moves can be very hard to spot. The bishop is going to be lost. Now, speaking of h5, maybe that actually is the best move. Of course, the big question is, what is White's response to knight takes d4? And in my experience playing this opening, these types of sacrifices are often very justified when Black's king is stuck in the center. And my bullet instinct here is to play knight takes d5, but I'm afraid to even try this move, Robert. Maybe that's a little bit too experimental. Maybe even queen c5 there looks pretty nasty. No, that's not what he played. He played bishop h3.
But that must... Ooh! Actually, bishop... Yeah, he's going for your knight takes d5 ideas.
But apparently knight takes d5, I just checked, is the best move in this position with an overwhelming advantage. So this would have been very, very strong for White. And just to very quickly show, knight takes f3, knight takes b6, and at the end, White recaptures the bishop with an overwhelming advantage in the endgame. But all of that is behind the scenes now for Ruja. Bishop to h3. And you're absolutely right, Robert. Knight takes d4. He is definitely planning the same exact idea.
He is trying to go for these tactics. He thought this would be a better maneuver because you haven't committed your pawns in that way. But knight takes d4, will be met probably by queen e3 with knight takes d5 to follow. This still looks really nice for white. So I don't think that Alireza is looking at this position like, oh, I have some problems here. He's looking like, I'm going to have an advantage no matter what I do. How big the advantage is, neither player knows regardless. The engine says this isn't quite as large. So bishop h3, it is a miss. h5 apparently better than direct attack, but he is still going to meet knight takes d4 with knight takes d5 fireworks,
I wonder if the lesser evil for black here is actually to castle kingside and to give up the pawn on t5. If we could put this on the board and we see Jan disappointed, no, Evalbar does not agree with me. Castles, knight takes d5. I was briefly thinking, okay, here was my logic. Bishop takes d7, rook to c7. And for some reason, I thought that maybe black can kind of quickly develop counterplay on the queen side. I mean, listen, I'm looking, and black's position is really, really dubious here. Maybe white can just drop the bishop back to f5, though, and knight takes d4. Okay, there's many things that white can do here. Even the very simple queen d5, bishop takes h7 check also comes to mind. But it's plus
Danya,
2. Mm-hmm.
I think it's instructive that your first instinct is to castle and give away a pawn, because that's how worried we are about black's position. So I think that human element is important to really consider. And this position, this is clearly good for white because you check on d3 and pick up the knight. But even from the starting position after bishop h3, like knight takes d4, according to Alireza Firouzja, it may not be untouchable, but it might be unwise to grab it because of these knight takes d5 tactics. And if you take my queen on f3, he says, I'll take your queen, and we get a very similar position as the one you were showing, but perhaps black has some better resources. I just don't think they're easy to find. I don't think there's any player on the planet who would want this position from the black side, and I truly believe that white wins this position like 90% of the time or something, because the bishops are so strong on the open board.
This endgame is out of the question for black. I think knight takes f3 is a mistake. E takes d5 needs to be investigated, but I would be terrified of playing it. One move that it's very easy to miss is this kind of weird-looking queen to c5 move. But in this particular version, I don't think queen c5 is dangerous anymore. At an absolute minimum, wait, no, the queen is hanging, so don't drop c3. At an absolute minimum, white could blunder the queen. But in the event that white does not want to blunder the queen, I don't know why that would ever be the case. Maybe a move like queen to e4 can be considered. But oh, is there queen takes? Why is it only 0.4? That's what's killing me about this. Why is it only 0.4?
I don't have the moves open, so that's queen takes b2 check. I think, as you were about to suggest, that is a wild move, but it ruins white's queenside pawn structure, and we are going to see a bunch of tactics. g7 is loose, the bishop on d6 is kind of hanging, but queen takes b2 check. What a renegade queen, throwing that away, but gaining some material in the process.
Only move, actually, to not be lost. I just checked. Unreal. And after bishop takes b2, knight takes f3, I just kind of assumed that after bishop takes g7, black is falling apart at the seams, but he's actually not. Rook to g8, and black is holding on here because white's got some hanging pieces, and with the queens off the board, e takes d5 is now a much more serious option to be reckoned with. So, for example, if white drops the bishop back to b2, I still think black's position is highly unpleasant. I probably would not go for e takes d5 just intuitively. Do not even mess with that. Maybe a move like bishop e5 can be considered. And imagine if we actually go down this line, how crazy that would be. I think Jan is desperate, Robert, to the point where he has to do something like this. Otherwise, he runs the risk of losing this game right out of the opening.
Yeah, it looks like he'll be steamrolled if he doesn't play something of this nature. So after knight takes d4, these kind of tactics, they all look like, from a distance, without an engine by your side, it looks like black is in trouble in all of them. But at least they get complicated to the point where you don't see the finishing touch for white. You think that black has some pluses in his own position, mainly minuses in white's position, more than pluses in black's. So knight takes d4. I was thinking that queen e3 is also an option there for white, threatening knight takes d5. The threat is strong in the execution, so they say. But either way, white is better. I don't think that's up for debate. With the bishop pair, an open board, and a potential endgame, black will have a lot to work through here. It does not look pleasant.
Yeah, I mean, maybe knight e7 can be considered here if Jan doesn't like the look. Exactly. That is exactly the sound I would be making to myself as I'm making that move. White follows up with h5. Okay, maybe Black Castle's kingside there and praise, but already g6. And Black will need his prayers to be answered because that position against Ali Reza Fallujah, yuck, yuck, yuck. No, this is not good. The Jababa London strikes again. I mean, regardless of how this game ends, what a successful opening experiment by Ali Reza Fallujah. I don't know. Jan clearly not up to date on his opening courses.